Hi there, thanks for listening to the summary recording of the first CRIS skills session of 2021-22, Project Planning and Implementing. As a bit of background, I did my own master's years ago in 2003, and then my PhD I finished in 2009, and from then I've really been a jobbing researcher on fixed term contracts until 2020 when I left research and became full-time on the Community Research Initiative. And there's always been lots of project management training out there, and I've been on many of them, always kind of trying to seek that magic bullet. You know, there's a secret that no one was letting me in on good project management. But I realized recently that I've always planned projects and implemented them on all of my research contracts. I planned my day, I prioritized tasks, I communicated appropriately and effectively with the right people that had anything to do with the project. So the aim of this super practical 1 hour session and the summary recording, for those of you who couldn't make it this week, it was to introduce students to 3 key areas of project planning that I wish I knew about in the start when I was doing my master's. So keep in mind while you're listening that a project can be anything. It can be an essay, it can be a house move, it can be arranging your friend's surprise birthday party. And of course, it can be your dissertation, and from CRIS's perspective, a collaborative dissertation with somebody else involved other than just you and your supervisor. So what we did at the beginning of the sessions was we took a snapshot of the students' own thoughts on their skills for project managing and planning. And we did this using Mentimeter. So we asked everyone to rate themselves on key project planning and project implementing skills between 1 and 5, where 1, I don't have this skill at all yet, up to 5, that I'm very skilled at this just now. And this is what we found. Here are the outputs from the sessions. We ran 2 sessions. You can see that with the first group on the left, they felt most confident about being able to adapt, and organizational skills was the second highest rated one. And in group 2, it was organizational skills as well, and this time management. You can see here and here and here on these spider diagrams. And it's useful to think about what skills you have and which you'll need to develop, because then you know where to improve and perhaps what training opportunities to seek out. So your research process skills will likely improve during the course of this master's. And you can see in both groups, understanding the research process was one of the kind of lowest rated skills. That's perfectly normal at the beginning of your master's. Other skills, you may have to look around for training. I can really recommend LinkedIn Learning, which you have access to as a UCL student, or even YouTube and Google. There's heaps of free resources out there to read up on, top tips on how to get improved organizational skills or tools to help manage your time better, as well as, ways of writing or communicating for different audiences. So the point of this term is to skill up now, map your skills so that you know what your gaps are, and so you can develop those skills. So now, while you're listening to this narration, think about your own ratings on these key project skills. How would you have scored yourself on organization, risk identification and solutions, understanding of research processes, communicating and reporting, time management, ability to identify stakeholders, and ability to adapt when things change, on that scale of 1 to 5? Next, we checked in on confidence levels around planning a project and managing relationships or people. And people make a project, not processes. We need people to run these processes and deliver on tasks. And here's what the outcomes were on Menti. We asked about confidence levels on planning a project in the first place, on managing a project, and on working with other people external to UCL. And you can see that in both groups, that last point, working with people external to UCL, is the highest confidence in both groups. And it looks like the planning stages are where students feel least confident. And that doesn't surprise me, given so many master's students are already in the workplace and are perhaps doing their masters at a different time in life, or doing it as part of their professional development. So now think about how you would have scored yourself. On the most left-hand side, you really don't feel confident at all in these three questions, or on the right-hand side, you feel really confident. How would you have scored yourself? So in this session, I introduced three key skills and tools to use for project planning. First, carrying out something called a stakeholder analysis. Second, thinking about risk identification, things that can go wrong. And three, identifying the kind of tasks and objectives that you need to do in a project, whether that is planning a wedding or a party, or in fact your dissertation, and mapping these across time. And we started with stakeholders. What are stakeholders? What does it mean when we talk about stakeholders? Essentially, these are people with a vested interest in a project and its outcomes. They can affect or be affected by the project. In business, typical stakeholders are investors or customers, employees or suppliers. So thinking about a research project or your dissertation, who are your stakeholders? Who are directly involved in the research project itself? Who are invested in its outcomes or findings, or the outputs, so the things that you deliver, the dissertation thesis itself, or other types of outputs perhaps. So what do these stakeholders want or need? Do they have influence, and how much? And how should they be involved? It's a good exercise in any project as soon as possible to articulate who your stakeholders are, what interests they have, because they won't all be the same interests depending on what type of stakeholder it is, and think about how much influence that stakeholder might have and how you would manage communication and working with them at this intersection of influence and interest. So I have an example from my research. I worked on a care home trial. The admin staff, we needed to work with them to identify care home staff to recruit. And arguably, they had very little interest in the research project. They didn't necessarily know what was being carried out in the care home, but they were very powerful because they held access to the lists of care home staff that we would like to ask to take part. So they essentially determined our success at recruitment. The relatives, however, of the people living in the care home, they had really high interest in the project because we were proposing to do something to improve things for the staff and therefore for their person that lived in the care home, but they arguably had very little power over the research at all. So how and what I communicated to these two stakeholder types was determined by this kind of power and influence interaction. The admin staff needed simple requirements for what we needed to help get in touch with staff, but they didn't necessarily need to know the background to the study or who our funders were or what we planned to do with the findings. Whereas the relatives often did want to know in detail the background to the study and were very interested in knowing what the future might hold if this study went ahead and what findings there were. So I hope you can see the differences between these two types of stakeholder examples I've given you and how that determined what and when I told them things. So the first task that we did during the sessions, and I'd like you to do now, is to take a few minutes to write down yourself all the people that you can think of who may be involved in a collaborative project, including those people who can be affected themselves. So in my example, it was relatives of people living with dementia. So take a few minutes now to write down all of the people who you would consider stakeholders in your research dissertation. Okay, and now moving on to the next task. Looking at your list and reviewing your list, who has influence or power over your dissertation, over the process of it, the findings of it? Who's got power or influence over what happens? And who might have interest, at what levels of interest, high or low interest? So go back to your list and mark a P beside who's got power over your dissertation, and mark an I beside who has interest. Okay, and the final stage of stakeholder analysis is mapping. And we asked students to think about their list and to map them onto this quadrant. You've got interest along the bottom, low running to high, and you've got power up the left-hand side, low running up to high. Think about your list now and where would you place them? Have they got high interest and high power? Have they got low interest but high power? Think now for a moment where on this quadrant your people would land. Do you recognise what your fellow students have put on this image? And why this is important is it tells you how you should engage with your stakeholders. So high power, highly interested people, you must manage closely. You must fully engage these people and make the greatest efforts to satisfy them. For people with high power who are less interested, you keep them satisfied. You put enough work in with these people to make sure that they feel satisfied in what they know and understand about the project, but not so much that they become bored, irritated, or inundated with your message. Those with low power but are highly interested, so remember my example, the relatives of people living in care homes, you need to adequately inform these people and talk to them to ensure that no major issues are arising. They can often be very helpful with the detail of your project and some real lived experience in my case, as I was talking about. And finally, you've got the low power and less interested people, and you must monitor these people. They're not inconsequential, but you mustn't give them excessive communication. We next moved on to risk analysis. Essentially, what could go wrong with your project? And there's heaps of things, and this analysis is a way of really preparing yourself to put contingencies in place to either stop them happening in the first place or to minimize the impact if they do occur. So that's the intersection that we're talking about with risk, the probability of it happening versus the impact of whether or not it does. And these are three examples, literally a Word document table or two kind of heat maps, which is these are the ones that I most prefer. What we're looking at is the probability along the top in this one or along the side in this one of something occurring and what the impact of it would be. And you can see with the heat map that anything that falls into this red bit is probably worth a lot of thought to either avoid or to mitigate it happening. And then with the green areas, these are probably, you don't need to prioritize quite so much. And what kind of risks are we talking about? Well, they can be anything. You can have technical, external problems, organizational, project management. There can be illness. There could be, you don't get ethics, you're unable to get ethics approval, unable to generate data or use a data set that you thought you were going to get permission to use. Your supervisor might leave. With a collaborative project, your collaborator might move on to a different charity. There's a lot more churn in that sector. So what we ask people to do is to list all the possible things that you think could go wrong with a project, with a collaboration. So for you, take a moment now to write down what you think are the things that could go wrong in your collaboration. And of course, let's think about identifying how probable the items on your list are that they might happen, and think about the impact that it would. So maybe, again, go through your list and put a P for how probable something is, and an I for the impact it would have. If it has a lot of impact, put an I on it. And we asked students to, again, on a heat map, the risks that they came up with as a group. And you can see here that we've included everything from personal, language, very specific about data, another national lockdown. I think parents withdrawing here is a project to do with young people as opposed to the students' parents. So yeah, there's, I think, quite a lot can impact your research, and I think that's right as a master's student compared to maybe a more experienced researcher. And I think most things are staying down in the unlikely to possible, with one or two up at highly probable. So these are things to focus on, and these are things that don't need much attention from you. So try using a heat map like this to map your own risks that you've identified. And finally, I introduced students to Gantt charts, my #1 project management tool. You may have many of these questions swirling around your head. You know, what needs to be done to complete this project, whether it's a party or a wedding or your dissertation or an essay or term 1, for example. You know, what else might happen along the way? Life, what things might get in the way? How long should the project take? What time is there for each task, therefore, and what order should you do things in? How do you know? Well, I do have one magic bullet for you, and that is a Gantt chart. And there's nothing more sinister to a Gantt chart than an Excel sheet. There are, of course, wonderful bits of software. There's probably an app. There's lots of Gantt chart stuff out there. For now, what you need is an Excel sheet. This is a Gantt chart that I submitted very early on, asking for funding. So it's reasonably less detailed. It's a lot less detailed than I would have developed it into. But you can see that down the left, I have a list of objectives. And across the top, I have my timescale. It was a proposed 3-year project. And I've divided each year into 2 halves. So, you know, there are problems with this. It's not that detailed, but the point of this is to show you how simple it can be. So what do I mean by it's not that detailed? Well, take this, for example, stakeholder interviews. And in my Gantt chart, that's running for 2 years. That's kind of quite vague to think about what you have to do in order to carry out stakeholder interviews. That's the very end action after a whole load of tasks. And it's a really long timescale, but it's also not a very well-defined timescale in weeks or months, for example. So stakeholder interviews, you know, what tasks might fall under these interviews that might help you break up that timescale a little bit more to show you in months even what you should be achieving. So, you know, you have to decide who to interview or email. You need to decide how you're going to interview people, how many people you're going to interview. You need an interview schedule. You potentially need ethics, although perhaps ethics is in my Gantt chart. But you might need to buy an audio recorder. You might need to identify someone that's going to transcribe the data for you. There's lots of things that might fall under stakeholder interviews, and it certainly needs a more nuanced timescale than 2 years like I've given here. So one of the last tasks that we did that I'd like to ask you to take away from today with, for your dissertation, to take you away from the weddings, away from the parties, let's think dissertation, you're going to have research aims and objectives. I can never quite get a handle on what a research question, research aim, kind of the differences, but ultimately you aim to show or do something with a project, and you have to achieve a set of objectives. And when you achieve those, it will lead you towards the aim being achieved. So for example, I've given you this here. I aim to demonstrate that training in compassionate care will lead to an improved quality of life for care home residents. So within that wide-ranging aim, I've kind of thought of a few things there. You need to develop the training. You might need to pilot the training. You'd need to identify the care home that you're going to pilot it in. You can see in the aim that you are proposing that it leads to an improved quality of life. Well, how do you know that's going to happen? You're going to have to measure quality of life. And so you're going to have to choose your quality of life measures, potentially pilot them as well. Apply for ethics approval. You can see everything on the screen there. So what a Gantt chart does is it takes this aim, it takes all the associated objectives and adds a timescale to it. So you break it down and you spread it over the lifetime of the whole project. And you may get an extension of funding, so you may need to extend that timeline, which is great. You may have a change in timeline for a different reason. There may be a pause in a timeline. You may also come across additional objectives or new objectives as something changes or a funder asks you to achieve something differently for some reason. So this is something of a living document to me in a very practical kind of research managing kind of way. So I set a final task to think about term one, think about a term one project. I gave one, I aimed to collaborate with a charity on a literature review about food bank use and mental health. So I asked students to calculate your term. We talked about this week, starting the 25th of October. How many more weeks are there left of term one? I suggested that maybe December might be, or the last 2 weeks of term, might be broken down into days so that you know what you have to achieve each day to make sure that everything is achieved within your timescale. You want to list all the objectives you can think of and the tasks within them to achieve that aim and check the order over the timescale. So for example, if it was a project that was interviewing people, you would not be able to recruit people until you had ethics. So that's something called a milestone. In this literature review, you wouldn't be able to use the search terms until you had determined your databases that you were going to use and you had agreed your databases. So there's a template Gantt chart that I created for you associated with this recording, which you can find on the web pages. Feel free to download this. At the top of the Gantt chart, I include kind of life events. I've made some comments at the top in red. Maybe you're, block out the holidays so that you make sure that you do get a break in the holidays between term one and term two. Maybe you do have a wedding to go to. Maybe you're doing volunteering over the summer, over the Christmas period. All these things I think is really helpful for a student and as a researcher. I think they're really helpful to have those represented on your Gantt chart as well, so that if you do have a bunching up of work at the wrong time for personal stuff, then maybe you should think about your timelines and think about what might be achieved to ease the workload. So do download that Gantt chart and go ahead and use it. I've started off some suggestions there for you. So in this skills session, we started the stakeholder analysis, we identified possible risks to a dissertation project, and we started the Gantt chart. So I hope that's been helpful to have a recorded narrative. Please take a moment now to fill in a progress log. You'll find a link to that beside this recording as well. It's helpful to think, what did you learn from this session? Is there anything that you've identified today now listening to this that you think you need to work on or go and find some training on? So thanks so much for taking the time to watch this summary recording. This was CRIS's Skills Session 1, Project Planning and Implementing. Hope to see you soon.